On the 5th of November, Supernatural, the longest-running American live-action fantasy TV series, revealed that Castiel, an angel, was queer. In what was described as a homosexual declaration of love, the angel confessed his love to Dean Winchester, a male lead, only to die a second later. After years of waiting for these two characters to get together, it had happened. Well, almost. With only 2 episodes left for the series finale, the audience assumed that the two will be reunited and the confession will be addressed. Unfortunately, Castiel, a prominent character for the past 11 years of the show, was forgotten and Supernatural ended. This sparked outrage among fans and dredged up accusations of queerbaiting, as well as the show's use of the bury your gays trope. In turn, a show that focused on two brothers, Sam and Dean Winchester, as they saved the world of monsters and demons with the help of their angel friend Castiel, sparked discussion of the crisis surrounding the representation of queer characters as well as issues of queerbaiting. And as issues of representations in queerbaiting have come under increasing scrutiny, the ending of Supernatural provides an opportune moment to assess some of Roach's claims. To be specific, in the 2 years that have passed since she wrote her article, Dean and Castell's relationship became canon, officially recognized in the show, and fans have become more vocal about the exploitative nature of Supernatural's queerbaiting, especially since queer relationships in media have made many strides. So, hello and welcome back to the I Have Thoughts podcast, a podcast all about your favorite shows, movies, and general media analysis. I'm your host, Elisa Hamoud, and today we'll be talking about an exciting topic, queerbaiting. And we'll be looking at Supernatural as a case study. I talked to a fan of the show, and I'll be bringing in some interesting opinions to today's discussion. Before we delve into Roach's chapter review, here is a brief history of queerbaiting. The attention to queerbaiting as a cultural practice is not limited to Supernatural. In fact, Roach's chapter is a part of a book edited by Joseph Brennan titled Queerbaiting and Fandom, Teasing Fans Through Homorerotic Possibilities. In this book, Brennan begins by explaining the lineage of queerbaiting, a term first used in advertising. In advertising, he gives the example of Levi jeans. What the company did was they would put two men on the poster and they would have them stand incredibly close to each other, so that for straight audiences or the straight consumer, they would just see them as just really close friends. And for queer people who had this so-called queer goggles that Joseph talks about, they would see a relationship. And that is how companies would benefit by pandering to two different audiences or without confirming anything. They kind of left it up for interpretation, and they made money out of it. And the modern understanding of queerbaiting, to put it simply, is characterized by a strategy designed to capture queer followings by suggesting a queer relationship between two characters and then empathetically denying and laughing off the possibility. So, kind of similar. Some stuff just haven't really changed that much. It's also worth noting that the term queerbaiting has been appropriated by fans who use it for activism purposes through transformative works like fanfiction, a practice especially exhibited by the Supernatural fandom. The way that it's being used as a form of activism is by taking these queer-baited relationships, for example, in shows, and kind of confirming them in their own pieces of work, or taking the way that this character has been fleshed out through all the queer-baiting that's being used and the way that they're getting queer-coded, and they kind of explore either themselves or the characters through these transformative pieces of work. While Brennan talks about a variety of different queerbaiting terms and just kind of the history of it, those are the two important ideas that we need to keep in mind as I continue this conversation. And another thing that we need to talk about are the negative effects of queerbaiting. Because queerbaiting as a whole does quite a few things. First of all, it really hurts and alienates the queer community, because they never confirm them or validate their sort of existence in these shows or these movies or whatever pieces of media. And the second thing that it does is that it creates tension between the writers of, for example, the show and fans, but also between fans themselves. Because what queerbaiting kind of does is that it encourages people to have their own interpretations through these kind of seeds that have been planted throughout the show's throughout the show's run, but at the end of the day, the writer is still enforcing his or her own ideas and their sort of preferred meaning of their pieces of work. And so that creates tensions with them, but that also creates tensions with other fans because they see something as canon and others as just an interpretation that maybe you look too deep into this. And so these are kind of like different ways in which queerbaiting can actually hurt the community. And so now that we know what queerbaiting is, let's talk about Emily Roach's argument. So as a fan of the show, I'm really interested to see how she argues her points, and I want to see if there is any validity to her critique or to her argument and analysis. And this will be especially interesting in light of the ending of the show, given that Roach's article was written during season 13. And we have 2 more seasons that weren't out yet. So before we kind of get started, let's kind of give a brief overview of what Roach's chapter is about. She first tackles the idea of Wincest, which is the romantic pairing of the 2 brothers, Sam and Dean Winchester, as a way to explain both fan pairings of characters as well as the way in which Dean Winchester was queer-coded. This carries forward a discussion of the bisexual panic of Dean Winchester, where she explains how he was portrayed and understood as queer long before the introduction of Castiel, arguably the strongest ship. Ship is a romantic pairing, kind of short for a relationship of the show. And this is followed by analysis of the show's queerbaiting tendencies observed through the uses of romantic film conventions when depicting Dean and Castiel's relationship on screen. To summarize, Roach attempts to explain that the shipping of these characters by fans and queer interpretations of these characters and these relationships didn't erupt from nowhere. So let's discuss. So Wincest. Wincest is seen as a subversive pairing by the queer community. And I personally did not see Wincest when I started watching the show, but it is worth noting that for the first 3 to 4 seasons, Sam and Dean were the only recurring characters. They also were the only fleshed out characters. There were also no other female characters, so there couldn't have been any straight relationships that would have been formed. So that's kind of like the scene where Sam and Dean are put together. And this kind of only changes when Castiel gets added in season 4, towards at some point in season 4. And kind of what Roach is trying to say, that the intensity of the brotherly bond is underscored by Sam and Dean's unconventional upbringing, which found them frequently moving around the country as their father sought to avenge their mother's death. And so Dean and Sam's relationship is a lot closer than normal, I guess, quote-unquote normal brother relationships, because they had to go through so much together. They literally grew up in isolation. They had to suffer by themselves. They had very emotionally complex relationships, and that kind of created an undeniable bond between the 2 brothers. And they always kind of found their way back to each other, no matter what happened, even though they diverged a lot. So she's trying to say that this kind of undeniable bond offers compelling textual dynamics for fans seeking to explore those tensions through a queer lens. And so I think we need to talk about this idea that in any fandom, people just want to ship something. They want some sort of romance to happen. And with only these 2 recurring characters, they were the easiest to ship. And I was talking with one of my friends about this, and she said that if you look at Sam and Dean as separate entities and not as brothers, you can kind of see them, because one of them is very butch, he's very strong and manly, and the other one is the more educated, refined, sensitive of the 2. And so they're different enough that there can be some sort of romantic relationship there if you read into it. To some people, they felt uncomfortable with the idea of kind of shipping 2 brothers, so they actually started shipping the real-life actors, which are Jensen Ackles and Jared Padalecki. Which I thought that was interesting, because, again, personally, I didn't ship these 2. I didn't read it, even through the queer lens, I didn't read it as that. But throughout the show, there are a lot of jokes about it. Roach talks about how, in an episode called Bugs, the 2 brothers are told, "We accept homeowners of any race, religion, color, or sexual orientation." And how throughout the show, at least mostly throughout the season 1 to 4, Sam and Dean are constantly being compared to famous lovers, which adds an erotic slant to the inextricable link the brothers share, which continues to pull them back towards one another when their attempts at pursuing individual paths fail. And that's because we actually do see in the show, every time they try to have their separate lives, even like going as far as like having a family, they always end up back together and their other relationships fail. And so she continues to talk about how the show introduces several characters who continue to do these misguided assumptions about the nature between the two brothers. But I think what she's kind of trying to get at, because one thing that I noticed while I was reading is that she focuses on Dean quite a lot and kind of Dean's responses to these things, because she says that it is the way the question compromises Dean's heteromasculinity that Dean seems to find the most troubling, as opposed to anything specifically related to the nature of his relationship with Sam. When I read this, I just thought that he was annoyed because he raised his brother. Again, they have a very strong bond because of their upbringing, so I thought it was more him being disgusted at the fact that people would suggest that with his brother than anything else. But I guess Roach is trying to take it another direction. But something also that my friend mentioned as I was talking to her about this is the fact that shipping doesn't just like come up of nowhere, at least not such an intense ship, because it's true that sometimes people read too much into certain relationships and what is written as platonic can be seen as something else. But in that Bugs episode, there are a lot of jokes that are being made. At one point, Dean even plays along with it and I think calls Sam honey and kind of like plays house. And so this is kind of like the way that the show planted the seed for the ship. But I think one of the most compelling arguments that she does is this idea that the brothers exist in liminal spaces, specifically in their car and in their motels. So for their job as kind of monster hunters, they have to travel a lot. So they do a lot of like road trips where they stay at random motels because they also don't have a lot of money. We know this from the first season. They kind of hustle for money. So it kind of made sense for the show and in the context of the show. But what Roach is starting to argue is that in American culture, the car is often the setting for early adolescent sexual experience, and the motel is associated with illicit sexual encounters. And she continues that it's in these erotic, queer, and liminal spaces that Sam and Dean share many of their most intimate moments away from the public gaze. So I thought that was interesting, especially when she pointed out American culture. Because I also asked my friend, who isn't American, and I asked her if because she had watched the show for a lot longer than me, if she had felt incest when she watched. And she said no. And then when I mentioned maybe it's like the American culture, she thought that that might have been why certain things by Western audiences can be read as erotic, while in other places in the world aren't necessarily read as erotic. And one of the biggest thing is the fact that the brothers are very, very touchy. And that's again a testament to their upbringing and the way that they had to live. But also it's very kind of known that in American culture, there is a certain idea of masculinity that rarely allows for this kind of touchy behavior when it comes to your sibling or your male friends. Whereas in other parts of the world, this kind of behavior is very normal. I mean, in some Arab countries, guy friends are very open with one another, and so are like siblings. So I think kind of looking at Roach's argument from the idea that it could be more Western, and it kind of makes me understand how incest could have become a thing and how this interpretation came about, since I couldn't see it. So now we kind of come to the end of this discussion. Because she kind of wanted to introduce the idea of incest and the way that like how this was kind of the first point of contact for the viewers and how this was kind of their first ship. It's kind of allowed them to explore these characters and kind of play around in this universe, but not only change the way that Dean's characterization is established, because he kind of tries to be overly hypermasculine, but through this kind of incest queerbaiting subplot that is happening in a way, it's established that maybe he isn't actually all that straight. And at the same time, she kind of uses this argument to talk about how it gave way for Castiel and Dean's pairing, or at least Dean's pairing with other male characters. So now we'll move on to our second segment about Dean's bisexual panic. I think it's really interesting that Roach starts off by saying, through using the phrase bisexual panic, I robustly reject the argument that Dean's relationship with women provides sufficient proof of unambiguous heterosexuality to the exclusion of all other possibilities. And I think that this one is a very important line, especially when we're talking about bisexuality, because unfortunately, bi representation, or at least someone being bisexual, is often erased when it comes to media. There's a lot of bi erasure because when a bi character gets together with someone from the opposite sex, they are seen as straight, and when they get together with their own sex, they are seen as gay. So it really erases the fact that they kind of go in between. And by saying this, she's not only kind of acknowledging how important and how kind of difficult this Dean being bisexual can be when it comes to reading it, but also one of the biggest arguments that fans that don't see Dean as being bisexual is the fact that they keep bringing up that, yeah, but he's with women all the time, so of course he's not bi. And so I think that's just like a great starter to her argument, and really like gives her points as she continues, because she then continues to say that reading Dean as bisexual is pivotal to the queerbaiting analysis in the context of Destiel. Destiel is the ship name for Dean and Castiel. She says that as I go on to explain, when I consider how revealing Dean to be something other than straight would be consistent with Dean's character trajectory to date. And that's also really important, because another issue that a lot of people have with the idea that, oh, Dean might be interested with Castiel, or Dean might not be straight, is they keep arguing that, yeah, but it doesn't fit his character. So I think the way that she's kind of taking her argument is really interesting, and kind of gives a very solid foundation to her argument about Destiel in the future, which we'll get to afterwards. So she first starts by giving textual evidence, actually. Roach gives a lot of examples of Dean not fitting heteronormative gender roles as evidence for his bisexuality. And while some are understandable, others I feel are taken out of context. So let's discuss this point and decide if her argument holds up, and maybe even if we have points that could have helped her argument. So the one quote that I feel like was more of a stretch and could have maybe used a different line that could have helped her argument was this line also from the episode Bugs. So they're walking in front of these beautiful white picket fence houses, and he mockingly says, manicured lawns, and how was your day, honey? I'd blow my brains out. So she's talking about how he's rejecting this idea of normal. He is showing his sort of divergence. He's showing the way that he might not be heteronormative, and kind of like this idea that he might be interested in other men. Now, the reason why I don't feel like this is a great argument to have, and why it kind of diminishes a bit of her argument, is because this was actually in the context where a few episodes before that, Dean and Sam reunite after Sam having run away from home. And he kind of is saying, Dean is kind of reaffirming to himself and to his brother that their upbringing, no matter how unconventional, it was still a great upbringing, and he wouldn't change it for the world. So he's literally talking about how he wouldn't trade his current family over the apple pie life type thing. And so I think context is really important in this example. So Roach already established this idea that Dean might be not straight by recognizing the fact that there is a ship called Wincest. And now she kind of delves deeper into what she likes to call bisexual panic. And why is she talking about this sort of panic that he's going through? She claims that Dean acts extra masculine. She points to a very specific scene, so let's listen to it.
Of course, the most troubling question is why do these people assume we're gay?
Oh, you're kind of butch. Probably think you're overcompensating.
Right.
So in this scene, we can deduce that Dean and Sam have been misread as together, again, and not as brothers. or at least what Roach is trying to say, is that Dean appears to be more troubled by people reading him as anything other than straight than people are suggesting that he's engaged in an incestuous relationship. Now, personally, I would like to argue against that, because I think that Dean and Sam's upbringing has been so unconventional that they have a bond that can be read as what's it called, almost romantic, even though it's platonic. And also, I think he's just generally really disgusted by the fact that he is being seen with his brother, or at least being shipped with his brother, because we know that in another episode where he meets people that are shipping him through this kind of like meta story that's happening, and he looks at Sam and tells him, they know we're brothers, right? Kind of talking about the fact that he isn't like too worried about the fact that his sexuality is being questioned, or at least we'll get into that in a bit, but more the fact that it's a disgusting aspect for him. But she likes to continue and says that there's something fundamentally queer about internal conflict between oneself and dominant societal structures and expectations. And she's saying that in this conflict, there's a queer resonance that feeds speculations around Dean's sexuality. And I mean, definitely one could argue that he has had scenes where he was in church and kind of confessing, and he says something along the lines of, there are lots of feelings I would like to feel, there's lots of relationships I would like to experience differently, which have been read by some fans as him kind of talking about sexuality and kind of like structure with it. And I think bringing up upbringing here is very important, because he was brought up by a father who was a Marine. Their father literally brought them up to be supernatural hunters. So she's saying that to some extent, maybe that Dean's practical modes of masculinity, which include being vocal about his promiscuity, watching porn, wolf whistling, and aggressive heterosexuality, all of which appear to equate with his version of being a man. And so it's kind of what Brennan and Roach kind of agree on is the fact that his sexual interest in women holds element of bombastic, unapologetic performativity that leaves no room for same-sex desire. They really kind of hammer in the point that he is kind of hyper-masculine to the point that it becomes a caricature, it becomes very performative, and he also keeps calling himself the meat man, so there's a very big emphasis on like steak and meat, even though there's a joke in the show where meat man apparently means that he's into guys. So here we're kind of seeing a duality of kind of, not only is it feeding his kind of masculine ego that he's trying to portray, his kind of excessive masculine front, but also the way that the show undermines it by doing jokes like these that kind of queerbait, because they tell the audience, well, I know he's showing you this, but I know he's telling you that he's, you know, all for women, but he's also doing this. So we have a lot of these times where just kind of dissonance happening, where he says, for example, I only like women, but then we see him get flustered when he's around attractive men, for example. So I think Roach is touching upon these things, the fact that Dean's sexuality seems to be a point of contention for a lot of people. And definitely I think his car is a very important thing. So he has a car, it's a Chevy Impala. It's this beautiful black car that has kind of been passed down by his father. He kind of holds it as the epitome of masculinity. And I think that it's important to look at the car, which is kind of what Roach is trying to talk about as well, because she talks about how the Impala is a site of masculine performativity that offers a visual space that is typically masculine, while simultaneously existing as a device through which to filter the more intensely emotional moments that characterize television melodrama. And that's really interesting, because there is a scene in the earlier seasons where Dean is kind of very emotionally constipated. His brother's mourning his girlfriend who had just died, and his sort of only way to comfort his brother is by telling him, oh, if you want, you can drive the car. And so here it's kind of seeing the way he channels his emotions through this literal masculine vehicle. So I think overall the way that Roach looks at Dean is very compelling and it kind of gives a different perspective and really validates what a lot of the fans have been saying from the beginning, that he actually isn't all that straight. Overall, I think this argument was really interesting and introduced me to a few new topics, like the idea of Paula being a filter. I think was an interesting touch. Um, but at the same time, I feel like the two qualms that I have with this is, first of all, which is what I already mentioned, the fact that there are better examples that she could be using, especially for the one about the manicured lawns. Um, and like, I don't think this is necessarily an excuse, especially because after 13 seasons, there was enough material. Season 14 and 15 didn't necessarily provide with new material that would have been groundbreaking for this chapter in particular, or for this segment in particular. I think it would have been interesting to also look at other male relationship that Dean has been, other than, you know, Castiel, which we'll talk about in a bit. But he has been linked to other male characters. So I think looking at him, or looking maybe at how he reacts to other male characters' attentions, would have been interesting than just to talk about his sort of relationship with his brother. Let's move on to an exciting piece, which is Dean and Castiel, a Hallmark love story. So I think this one is my favorite segment because it has one of my favorite arguments that Roach gives. And she argues that many conventions of slow-burn romance are used in Supernatural when writing and portraying Dean and Castiel. She kind of first explains that this idea that Castiel fills the space left by Sam, literally and metaphorically, but he also transforms it for Dean and the audience. So when we first meet Castiel, Dean couldn't see Castiel, he's an angel. All we know is that he has been marked. There's a handprint on his shoulder. And then sparks fly, and this angel comes up, and then throughout the season we kind of get to see more interactions between the two. They do have very intense stares where the camera really lingers on their faces for too long. We also have a point where Sam has been trying to get in contact with Cass. Cass is short for Castiel. And he has been trying to get in contact with him, and he wouldn't answer. And then Dean asks for him once, and he shows up. And Cass's sort of excuse is that they share a more profound bond. And this is interesting because even though Castiel saves Sam later on in a very similar way that he saves Dean, he doesn't have the mark, and he doesn't have this like profound bond. So there definitely is a difference between the way in which Castiel and Dean interact and the way in which Castiel interacts with other characters, which is kind of what planted the seed from the get-go. And we're literally talking the first episode that Castiel's ever in. But I think what's important here, and what she's really trying to hammer home, is this idea that Sam and Dean set the path, or like created the way for Dean and Cass to flourish. So she gives the example where Dean is fussing over Castiel's outfit, or another moment where Dean and Castiel are laughing at the fact that they had to run away from a brothel because of an issue that was happening, and just the absurdity of it all. And she's saying about how these scenes, even though we've previously seen Dean fix, for example, Sam's tie or something, these are more reminiscent of rom-com scenes than typical Sam and Dean interactions, which are now seen more as a older brother helping his little brother. At the same time, we also see other parallels with actual romantic couples. There is a couple on the show called Kane and Colette, and it's been confirmed by one of the actors on the cast that Colette is meant to be a character that Castiel mirrors. And we also have other examples where Dean uses pickup lines on Cass. So there definitely is an element of romantic film techniques that are being used. And I think what's interesting is that Roach says that although similar narrative techniques are used to highlight the homoerotic possibilities in both relationships, Dean and Castiel strategies often go a step further. And she talks about how these signifiers are familiar, kind of like how I was talking about Dean fixing Sam's tie, for example. And so she's saying that the signifiers are familiar. The audience has seen similar settings and interactions. before between Dean and Sam, but the narrative and filmic strategies take on a distinctly more romantic nature in the context of Dean and Castiel. And what's important is that relationship is free from any barriers or dynamics that would render any eroticized components to be taboo. And so I guess to kind of end this idea that Dean and Castiel have a Hallmark story, we're going to talk about memorable examples. So we've already established that in the case of Dean and Castiel, the assumptions take on a more overtly romantic overture. And we see that in an episode called My Heart Will Go On, where another angel called Balthazar tells Dean, "You have me confused with the other angel, you know, the one with the dirty trench coat who's in love with you," because Castiel wears a trench coat and that's his iconic outfit. So here we're having a literal other character telling the viewers, not only validating what the viewers are saying, but also putting that in the show. And this is not the first time that a character has commented on this, has commented on their relationship. So I think it adds to the fact that, oh, well, if other people see it, then it must be true. Except for then for the showrunners to turn around and say, no, we weren't writing it that way. That is where queerbaiting becomes an issue, because they are planting these seeds, but then they're telling us that no, they are meant to just be brothers or friends or just kind of war buddies to a certain extent. Then we have another scene. So there's an intense stare down that's happening where Cass is looking at Dean, and Dean says, "Cass, not for nothing, but the last time someone looked at me like that, I got laid." And he follows it up with a wink. And so Roach kind of explains that for fans and the cell shippers in particular, these moments between Dean and Castiel have a very different impact than the homoerotic energy that is part of Sam and Dean's relationship. And another testament to the fact that Dean's character can be seen as bisexual is because throughout the show, Dean is shown to have this kind of obsession where he's following the show called Dr. Sexy, and he's kind of in love with this guy. At one point he ends up meeting him and he's flustered the entire time and he can't really answer anything. We have another scene where he enters a brothel because he has to interrogate a man and he's sleeping with a bunch of women, and he lifts the sheets and looks at the man and comments. So these are scenes that are implanted, and of course people are going to read into them because they're there. And while some of them could be said, oh, but they're jokes, unfortunately, there is no punchline, so it's definitely being read as something more. And I think that's kind of what Roach is trying to say, that like these aren't solo events. This is a pattern that's happening that kind of sets up Dean to be queer, and he's kind of queer coded from the beginning. So I think now that we've discussed the characters themselves, let's zoom out in a segment called "But the Writer Said So." So Supernatural fans have a unique relationship with the actors on the show and the cast members. And certain actors, like Misha Collins, which is the actor of Castiel, has contributed quite a lot to queerbaiting. Joseph Brennan actually uses him as the opening statement in the introduction, where he talks about how Misha Collins at a convention queerbaited and gaslit his fans by telling them that in this one scene that he filmed, Dean tells Cass that he loves him, but that it was removed and they have no way of kind of disproving him. So here he is not only kind of putting this seed into these people's minds, but he's also telling them that you have no proof, so if you tell other people that, then you're kind of going to get bullied, because that's one of the biggest kind of issues when it comes with queerbaiting is this like bullying kind of toxic culture that erupts from it. And at the same time, we have other actors like Jensen Ackles, who plays Dean, who's very opposed to Castiel and actually said at a convention that he played Dean to be straight and that he doesn't see him as bisexual. So as much as the actors have input into their characters, it seems that he was written in a way, or at least some of his characteristics have either taken a character of their own, a life of their own, or he literally just happens to play him as bisexual. And I think finally we need to talk about fans, because fans actually do have a lot of power. I mean, so do writers and so do all the other people on the show. We can talk about how the network helps with the queerbaiting. The CW has been accused of queerbaiting quite a lot. and Supernatural happens to be on the CW, so it would make sense for this history to continue. But fans also do have a lot of impact, uh, especially Supernatural fans. I mean, they themselves have altered the actual show. The show has killed off many female love interests because of fan outrage. And I think fan fiction, the way that queerbaiting gets reappropriated and being used as activism, is really interesting, because not only can people explore themselves, but the characters, and it's overall an interesting kind of topic to look at, which was mentioned a bit in the introduction and a bit in the chapter with Roach, but not really kind of covered as much. So let's talk about Castiel in 2020, because something big happened. Castiel became canon. Well, kinda. So interestingly, Roach, who again wrote this during the 13th season, tried to guess what would happen when the show ended. We're gonna read her guess, and we're gonna see if it's actually true or not. Then she says, a canon relationship between Dean and Castiel is theoretically possible, and some would argue theoretically probable. In the absence of the familial bond and the presence of scenes that build the intensity of the characters' relationship, then she continues that if Supernatural does not intend to take this route, it is unsurprising that fans have become frustrated by the use of queerness, let alone the agony of closeted queerness, a punchline that serves to further other and already marginalized queer identity. So, I think what's interesting about this is the fact that both these things happen. I know she wrote it as this or that, but funnily enough, both things happen. So the relationship did become canon, but people were very frustrated with the way that it was handled. So let's actually find out what really happened. In season 15, episode 18, Castiel declares his love to Dean and is promptly killed off. And this is where there are arguments within the fandom themselves. Some argue that since the show confirmed the sexuality and subsequently love between the two characters, can it still be considered queerbaiting? Or is it more complicated as Dean didn't acknowledge the confession and the bury your gays trope was used? So I think that's where both her arguments or both her guesses can be used. First of all, yes, this was a very natural progression. It made sense for them to end together. But at the same time, the fact that people are mad, and the reason why they're mad is because after Castiel confesses and ends up going to this kind of version of hell for angels, for the next two episodes, he's kind of forgotten. The message that was kind of sent out with Castiel's love confession was that after he confessed, he was promptly erased and just forgotten, and he couldn't actually enjoy this relationship, and the person he loves never talked about it, never even acknowledged his own feelings for Castiel. So it definitely still counts as queerbaiting, and it doesn't erase the 11 years that some people have spent shipping these two characters. It also just did a disservice for the show because it ended on such a sour note for a lot of the fans. And another thing that we need to consider, which goes back to the history of queerbaiting, Supernatural used queerbaiting as a marketing tool. They literally went back to basics. So even though Castiel technically died in episode 18, he was still being used for promotional content and kind of hinted that he might come back in the last two episodes. And of course, he never did. And so a lot of people were pretty bummed out about it because they thought, we were gonna finally get some closure for this character. Also, a lot of people that hadn't watched Supernatural in ages came back and rewatched it because of, one, the fact that it's the final season, but also because Castiel became canon, and so it literally was a way to bring back or kind of hold an audience for the last three episodes, which makes it really disgusting. So yes, that's kind of unfortunate that that's how it ended, but I think it's still kind of interesting that Roach managed to really hit the nail on the head when it comes to how the show ended, and kind of this outrage that happened, because after the show aired and this horrible message was kind of sent out about how you couldn't find happiness in your own sexuality, there was a Twitter campaign going around with the hashtag they silenced us, hashtag they silenced them, and the fans created Castiel project where they donated $50,000 to the Trevor project to help other queer minors. So, final thoughts. Was it a good chapter? Could it have been better? Was the argument convincing, and did it help me see the issue in a new light? Why should we care? I just spoke for who knows how long. Why should we care? So, I think that the chapter itself provides an interesting take on the characterization of Dean, an explanation of fan behavior when it came to fan fiction, and just kind of like the show's blatant queerbaiting. But it also felt like at some times it lacked nuance to the argument. Roach briefly mentioned the writers' and actors' influence, and instead the characters were treated as separate entities existing in the vacuum that is their fictional universe. The chapter kind of ignored actions of the writers and the networks, as well as the endorsement of actors that encourage or discourage despairing, because Brennan brought up the importance of this peculiar parasocial relationship between the actors and the fans in his introduction. The introduction was very robust and very informative, and had a lot to say, and kind of promises that it made, that I felt like there was still much to be desired when I finished Roach's article. And actually, when I first read it, I thought it would be really interesting to see Brennan's take on this chapter, because he seems to be really acquainted with this topic and may have a different kind of analysis that could have been more nuanced. Who knows? At the same time, I do have to say that for a book that is the first book on queerbaiting, it's a perfect introduction, and it kind of touches on a lot of things, and the book itself seems really interesting. I'm compelled to read more articles in this book, because it talks about different shows and their queerbaiting tendencies. So I think it's definitely an interesting book, and both Brennan and Roach did an amazing job at kind of explaining what queerbaiting is and how it's manifested. But at the same time, why should we care? And I think Brennan explains it perfectly. When he was young and he was looking for guidance on how to kind of understand his own sexuality, because he is gay, so he was looking for any representation on screen, and unfortunately, when he found one that he thought was going to be like him, that he can see himself in it, he ended up getting queerbaited. And what that showed was that he's alone in this sort of like journey and like kind of discovering yourself and so on. And at the same time, it's generally just hurtful to see these characters that are like, oh, maybe I'm like you, but actually, never mind, I don't want to be like you, I want to fit in, or whatever it may be. So I think it does a lot of harm when it comes to the queer youth, queer minors. At the same time, as media keeps progressing and we keep having good representation of queer characters and queer relationships, it's important for fans to know what queerbaiting is and point it out when it occurs. Now we saw that with Supernatural, where they just got called out for all of the stuff that they did to all their queer characters. And I think now that we know that there is a word for queerbait, that there is a word that explains what queerbaiting is, and that there is this word, we can start using it to shed more light on the problem and really let the audience voice their issues. That's why it's important to learn about these topics and have more public discussions about them. So I think my last point is, did it help me see an issue in a new light, or was an argument convincing? I think, as much as I came in hating Wincest, which I'm still not particularly a fan of because of its nature, but I think I never really understood it, and I do have to say that some of Roach's arguments kind of helped me understand it, and helped me understand why some people interpreted this relationship as anything other than platonic and brotherly. And so I think that was an interesting takeaway from the book, or from the chapter. I was your host, Elisa Hamoud, and this has been an amazing discussion about queerbaiting and Supernatural. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next week with a new episode. If you want to keep up with the I Have Thoughts podcast, check us out on Twitter and Instagram at I Have Thoughts P. Stay safe, stay healthy, and bye!